I'd like to thank the presenters and I'd like to thank the audience for being here today. My goal was to be able to see the screen and the lovely people there, but I can't, so I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me well. The talk that I'm going to give you today is about native speaker ideologies and speech-language pathology, a recipe for chaos. My name is Yolanda Holt. I'm an associate professor in communication sciences and disorders at East Carolina University in Greenville. I am a speech-language pathologist and a sociophonetician with an earned PhD from Ohio State University. I study language variation in English in the United States, in the Southern United States. And although my talk today is situated in the context of English in the US, the constructs being discussed can be applied to other languages with standardized linguistic ideologies. I'd like to thank Dr. Kamran Khan for his beautiful setup for what I'm going to share with you today. And I hope you can find some parallels in what I'm sharing with you as well as what you heard earlier. During our time today, I will share information on the etiology of native speakers as described in the literature. I'm going to argue that this etiology is globally harmful as it is commonly used today. I will argue that speech, language, and linguistics researchers and practitioners must expand their notions of linguistic competence, a foundational construct in native speaker ideology. In order to accurately, efficiently, and effectively do science, understand the dynamic living body that is language, and provide effective speech-language interventions to consumers. So, in the United States, the profession of speech-language pathology was established during a time when variation from middle-class white American communication norms was frequently defined as undesirable and sometimes as disordered. The narrative of being a Native American English speaker in the United States is indebted to economics, a stable income, a heteronormative family structure, and access to education. This narrative is constructed from scientific observations that were developed in the literature of the middle-class white American as the standard of morals, education, and the correct way to speak. The narrative was repeated and reinforced, and it resulted in a common understanding, sometimes known as the truth, of expected linguistic behavior. Henry, 1943, advised that the early speech correctionist, the precursors to the speech-language pathologist, should work cooperatively with medical doctors to identify the presence of speech defectives in members of the general population. By 1952, the American Speech-Language Hearing Association, commonly known as ASHA, was the well-established formal organization created for the express purpose of serving the needs of the speech handicapped. But wait a minute, who are the speech handicapped? How are they defined? And how does the scientific community recognize the symptoms to describe and diagnose a speech handicap? It can't be just anyone who does not meet the criteria used to define the heteronormative middle-class white American family. Of course, that definition can be used. Glazier and Moynihan, 1963, wrote of Black Americans, "The Negro is only an American and nothing else. They have no values and culture to guard and protect." This argument in the document that became known as the Moynihan Report stated plainly that the failure of individuals and groups to fully assimilate to white, middle-class American values and culture was and is both a moral failure and a rejection of the appropriate value system. This is the narrative of the native speaker. So the narrative continues today in conversations surrounding the need for everyone to acquire native-like proficiency in English. The quiet part that I'm going to say out loud, and I exhort you to say that as well, is that native proficiency is a proxy for being a middle-class, white American English-speaking person. This narrative presumes that linguistic competence is assimilation to those values because it is the standard, because they said so, because it is necessary for the operation of business, the government, and education. Other ways of communicating are then measured against that standard. I am arguing that it is time for us to recognize that following this narrative, the narrative of the native, is a choice, and it is time for us to choose differently. But wait, what is the other choice? Well, the other choice is just another perspective where we reject the constructs of standardization and the native speaker as a singular monolithic model, and instead think broadly and realistically that the actual truth of the native speaker is expansive. It's a mosaic of all people that use American English as their linguistic communication code. The mosaic then becomes, in the strong position that I'm sharing with you today, inclusive of second language learners, regional and socioethnic versions of that code, but also for people with cerebral palsy or dysarthria or apraxia. In short, any people that use the linguistic code to communicate. The research community can resolve to expect and accept wide variation in human communication without pathologizing its existence. We can further expand our thinking about disorder in speech and hearing science, and we can choose to accept culturally competent communicators simply as competent communicators. For the rest of my time today, I want to focus on step 3 of the labels outlined in the role collective, checking our assumptions. So I've spent a bit of time introducing the idea of native speakers and the narrative of the native speaker. Here are some thoughts that I would ask you to consider about nativism as a construct. First, the native speaker is idealized. The picture that I showed you of that middle-class white American financially stable family. And supposedly they have innate language competence. Well, they do if that's the code that's used in their homes and in their communities. And if they're chosen to be representative of what a native speaker sounds like, then there is innate language competence. The construct is also tied to a homogeneous speech community and a uniform national identity. Native speaker ideals are not confined to the U.S. English. There are preferred codes in languages such as Colombian Spanish, Beijing Mandarin, Parisian French, and Southern Standard British English. Now, I'm from the South, and we don't have the same recognition as being the standard here in the U.S. as it is in Britain. But when even so-called native learners can be excluded in the construct of a native speaker, I suggest that that lacks a theoretical grounding. This construct is then expanded to be epistemic in its exclusion. So, as I stated, I study variation in the Southern United States. And if all people born in a country who use the language every day aren't native speakers, then what are they? Their speech is assigned the category regional dialect variant, social ethnic variant, and many people work diligently to neutralize that regional variation. I would argue that they erase pieces of themselves in order to more closely fit what the narrative of the native suggests they should. I argue we can reframe our language experiences, and in the words of the Crip linguists, expand the definition of native to include all languaging bodies. But what would that require of us as researchers and practitioners? Let me show you.
Or you'd hear in community when you go from region to region, they're really different voices and sounds.
Guy in front of the White House there, in the back of that woods, way back there. It's deep back there. Which they had logged some of it out, but back on the woods where we hunt bears. But usually me and dog would go out there and move the field paths so they can see them real good. So it's $500 that's to go, and $500 to kill one. So it's very expensive shooting bears. Well, swing by there and show them with me on way back through. Let's swim up to that.
You can tell the difference between an African American who lives in Northeast, because they say scrape, which is not something you'd hear.
Bear with me as I bite my mouse. So this short 50-second video clip is from the North Carolina Language and Life Project. It shows two talkers. They're both from North Carolina, which is in the southern United States. If you easily understood one person but not the other, is that a them problem or a you problem? Should one of the people be required to modify their speech in order to gain access to education, business, and government services? Remember, these are both native speakers. Just something for you to think about, because this is where the reframing occurs, not in the university lab, in the communities where we research, where we serve, and where our research outputs are used to make decisions on people's everyday lives. Who shall be called disordered? It is up to us. So what can and what should we do? So one idea is to think about an ethnographic approach. We could start by examining both ourselves, our work, and our research using such an approach. But that can be quite challenging because first we have to ask, who am I? Who are you? The ethnographic approach involves immersive work in a specific sociocultural and sociopolitical context. To be effective, the work requires the researcher or therapist to reflectively evaluate their own sociocultural and sociopolitical perspective with respect to the standardized language and the language of interest. In this approach, the goal is to integrate both the speaker, the native speaker ideologies, and their intersection with language competence, language dominance, and language standardization. We would need to embrace complexity. So the 50 seconds that you spent with those two Native American English speakers might have challenged your ears. Okay, that means that just in the same way that we look at linguistic complexity across multiple frames, we need to think about the people that embody that. We would also need to think about it from a top-down and bottom-up community-engaged approach that goes beyond cultural awareness. Community engagement means asking and thinking from the perspective of the community, asking and thinking, not talking and telling. For African Americans, the current narrative of the native speaker has resulted in decades of deficit theories with respect to African American English, or as it's also known, English. The deficit thinking refers to perceiving certain groups or individuals as inherently in a state of lack or deficit. The non-native speaker framework sees this lack as a linguistic competence lack, oftentimes as an educational lack or a cognitive lack, or a lack of the ability to learn. This is what's going on in the US right now with respect to the idea of requiring African American English speakers to acquire standardized versions in order to acquire literacy. When we contest these native speaker norms, we contest other ways of thinking about disorder and difference, or just another acceptable version. I'm using AAE here as an example, African American English, sometimes also referred to as African American language. But this approach can be applied to all forms of human language. What is the implication then for speech language pathology? In the assessment and treatment of speech language disorders, this approach requires the researcher and practitioner to recognize that systematic variation within and between groups of native speakers, meaning all the people, exists, and that it's our responsibility to understand how these people are communicating with each other, all of the people. We can think about multilingual clients in this scenario. We can think about culturally sensitive assessments, which were developed with our conversations with the community. And we can think about avoiding chaos and identifying people who are not disordered as disordered by embracing the linguistic and human diversity. So let's briefly look at how community engaged scholarship can help us address and reframe the narrative of the native. When we think of community engagement, we want to think of language ideology, institutional practices, dominance relationships, and the advocacy for inclusive language policies. The purpose of community engagement is to empower the community, the people that we are interacting with, to advocate for policy changes, language policy, educational policy, any policy that disenfranchises or disempowers the others. The goal is to effect social change through transformation of both the community and the researcher. The self-reflection that's required of the researcher. So the community engaged research that I'm going to talk about quite briefly, it comes from the work of Kurt Lewin in the 40s and Paulo Freire in the 70s, where we're talking about community-based participatory research with traditional indigenous communities of the Americas. This is a historical context and future directions. They were recognized for social transformations, for the framework of community members and practitioners working as co-partners in research, which is very hard. And we're going to talk about some other ways that that can be approached. The goal is the cultural transformation, both of the community and the researcher. And I want to pause briefly right here to talk about power sharing and the fact that if you empower a disenfranchised community, the power structure that is currently in place will push back. So part of our responsibility, if we choose to do this work, is to help people in these communities understand what their power actually is. In a democratic society, it's the power of the vote and the power to organize. But this is hard work and requires yeoman's labor. It's a daily task. If that is beyond your capacity, there are other ways to engage with the community to help them become empowered. There is the idea of community engaged research from none at all on the left to community-driven and community-led on the far right. Community-based participatory research is just below that level. You also could think about community-informed research, where we're talking to the people in the community about their idea about our research question. You can have community consultants as you are developing your research question, help you to think about it in a way that makes sense to them in their daily lives. You can have community participants, not as objects or subjects, but as actually people who are helping you to think through your processes of engaging with the community in a way that allows them to derive a direct benefit from the process of the research, as well as from the products and the output of the research. This is the larger model of community-based participatory research, where we think about the context with relationship to social and political structures, to health, to the capacity and readiness of the community to participate with you. Sometimes it takes a while to build that up, to the development of collaboration and trust within the community, the partnership process, which requires negotiation between the community partner, the community members, the funders, and the researcher to develop the way that the questions will be asked, the way that they'll be answered. And with respect to understanding in our instance here, levels of language use and flexibility. When we think about the processes and the outputs, if the only way that your research is shared is in a academic journal, then you've already cut the community members out. They can't even access it if they wanted to, typically due to paywalling. So if you're doing work where we're thinking about language ideologies and the work that you're doing is not accessible to people through common means like newspaper, radio, and television, blog posts, or even person to person, then perhaps that's not going to be an effective way to think about our ideas of language and think about language change. In particular, you want to think about whether or not you have to go to the library to get a book and to gain knowledge, or whether that knowledge lives in the community. So I could go to my neighbor's house and learn about it. If we've done our work with community-based and community-engaged research, we've talked to the people in the community about what we are doing and how what we are doing impacts their daily lives. When we think about CPBR, which is community-based, CER, which is community-engaged, and CIR, which is community-informed research, we're thinking about an approach that requires us to think about equity, respect, and collaboration. The goal of all three of these approaches is to seek the same general outcomes, to integrate knowledge with action, achieve social change, improve health outcomes, particularly for historically disadvantaged groups, and to ensure the community members learn to act in ways that change the existing policies. We have three core principles, which are collaboration, mutual benefit, and respect. One question we have to think about ourselves as we think for ourselves as we talk about the idea of this language ideology and this language policy and this native speaker is, what is a community? So at the very beginning, I talked about the native English speaker as belonging to a community of middle-class white Americans. And then everyone has to be a member of that community or move towards that ideal in order to be a native speaker. But if we think about community as a group of people who share common interests, characteristics, perhaps geographic location, and interact with one another, then communities can take many, many forms. And when we think about the native speaker, if we expand that definition to include all of the people, then there will be groups within those within that populace, and those groups self-organize to form communities. The other aspect is the idea of social support, shared resources, collaboration, and the sense of belonging. And when we think about language and the ability to use language to communicate an idea, to be a person, standardized language policies require you to think about language in a particular way. The idea of being a native speaker and not saying things in a particular way excludes people from participating and having a sense of belonging. And although this is a very qualitative and socio-behavioral approach to thinking about language, it's a very qualitative and socio-behavioral approach to thinking about language as a way of engaging and belonging. The mutual benefit component also refers to a core principle that emphasizes both the researcher and the community gain advantage and positive outcomes from the research collaboration. Thinking back again to the idea of what are we doing when we're engaging with community, and what are we doing when we're asking research questions that don't engage with the community from the community's perspective. Long-term sustainability, collaborative decision-making, and equity and fairness are things we should keep in mind. We have a reciprocal relationship where both researchers and the community derive value. Respect means that the community member is involved in the research process with dignity, consideration, and fairness. And that's a building block for developing trust. Respect comes from fair and culturally sensitive interactions. When we think about another perspective of human language and competent communication, we can change the narrative by engaging with the members of the community to help define what native speakers know, what they do, and that you can be a native speaker without being a standardized language speaker. So looking specifically at what that means for speech language pathologists and people that are going to be working to identify disorder within populations, there's a preferred practice pattern from ASHA that includes a case history, interview with the family, a review of their ability to hear, see, and think, then standardized and or non-standardized measures of speech and language, identification of potential for effective intervention, the use of standardized measures and their documented ecological validity and cultural sensitivity with a population, and follow-up services. When we think about the testing practices that go into the identification of disorder, they're based on standardized measures from Standard American English. The documentation of ecological validity and cultural sensitivity further allow us to make sure that what we're identifying as a disorder is actually a disorder. The case history, the review, and ensuring that the person can actually hear and does not have difficulty thinking seem to be straightforward, but we're going to take a quick look at that. So in diverse communities, there's been previous research on speech sound assessment for multilingual children, and there are a number of ways to do that. With respect to language diversity, with respect to speech sound disorder, with respect to disorder in general, anyone who doesn't fit the standardized model is probably going to benefit from the perspective of a multilingual assessment. That's not what we're going to talk about today, but I want you to be aware of this as a construct. In a sociocultural approach to evaluations, you would use something like a norm reference measure or a criterions reference measure or a dynamic assessment. And we're going to approach the dynamic assessment today. I'm going to skip this for us. The dynamic assessment is a test, teach, retest protocol where we observe and evaluate the learning process. It measures the potential of the child to acquire whatever the skill is. It assesses their ability with the standard instrument, which is based on standardized language practices. Then the person doing the assessment would conduct a mediation where they teach the skill, and then they repeat the testing to assess the learner's outcomes. This dynamic assessment focuses on learning and helps to identify the likelihood of a difference. This person just doesn't use the standard form or a disorder. It's believed that this way is best for determining whether or not a disorder exists, and it also emphasizes learning as a process, as a part of the assessment process. Dynamic assessment is highly interactive and it's process-oriented, so you're teaching what you want the person to do. Here is an example. So if the standardized assessment says, show me the one that is empty, the language form as well as the vocabulary form are required to be known in order to pass the assessment. So if you don't know what the word empty means, you have no idea what you're being asked to do. And maybe you know what the word empty means, but you don't know it in this context because you've never taken this assessment before. If we were to do a dynamic assessment, and we're going to use African American English as the example here, the person might say, the one that ain't got no eggs is empty. Show me the one that's empty. Well, the one that ain't got no eggs is the one on the left. And that's an example of how recognizing that a person can be competent and a competent communicator, even if they don't use the standardized form of the language, they're not a native speaker, would work. So when we translate these ideals to practice, that requires us to think about multilingual assessment in a very broad way, the same way we think about native speakers in a very broad way. Thinking about stimulability, family involvement, the ability to transcribe what the person has said, cultural considerations, and then the use of validated tools, but in a dynamic form. When we think about a practitioner, and this is specifically referring to a person who's a speech language pathologist, but it can be any person who's a researcher or works in this realm, your relationship to power tends to be based, at least here in the US and in most Western societies, on your formal education, your ability to not have a disability, whether you are slim, your housing status, your wealth status, and your sexual status, whether or not you present as a person who is heteronormative. And when we're thinking about language, these are also things when we think about native speakers of who they are and who they can be. As a researcher, as a speech language pathologist, as a linguist, as a person who's working in this arena, there are some reflective questions to help you think about an ethnographic approach. What communities do you belong to? How does your community inform your worldview? How do you integrate your ideas with those of the other communities? And do you have a binary view of what's correct and error with respect to speech sound disorder? In the real world, we have to conduct universal screenings, we do standardized test assessments, we do modifications, and we make a judgment on the presence or absence of disorder. But what I'm asking us to do today is to think about embracing linguistic complexity, that variation is to be expected and respected, and that language is a dynamic and growing system. The goal should always be to identify when people are effective and efficient communicators, and that labels matter. I have a few more slides that are just the references here. These will be made available for you. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I think we're ready for questions.